The roar of a P-47 Thunderbolt fills the sky. It's 1944, deep into World War II, and the Allied forces are pushing forward with relentless force. The P-47 is one of the toughest, most resilient fighters of the war, a flying tank, capable of taking unimaginable damage and still coming back for more. But what happens when that tank's pilot has to make a decision that will determine whether or not his entire squadron survives? This is the story of a pilot who faced that exact choice, one that no one could have predicted, and one that would forever change the course of a mission that seemed like just another routine escort. But in war, even the most seemingly ordinary operations can spiral into chaos in the blink of an eye. And when a single split-second decision can make the difference between life and death, everything is on the line. What if, in that moment, the pilot decided to ditch his plane and risk everything, not for himself, but to protect the team he swore to fight alongside? It's a decision that, to this day, raises questions. How far would you go to save your comrades? What would you sacrifice in a battle where survival is never guaranteed? But most importantly, what happened after the skies above became a deadly battlefield? And how did one man's courage make all the difference in an otherwise routine mission? The shocking truth? The battle had only just begun. But before we dive into the dramatic moments of the dogfight, let's take a closer look at who this pilot really was, and what pushed him to make the call that would save his team and change the course of the mission. Lieutenant James Hawk. Halston wasn't just another face in the squadron. He had the kind of quiet confidence that earned him respect the moment he walked into a room. He wasn't flashy, didn't boast, and never sought out the spotlight. But when it came to flying, the man was a force to be reckoned with. Halston was one of those pilots who had a knack for reading the skies, sensing danger before anyone else did, and making decisions in the heat of battle that others couldn't even comprehend. His calm demeanor was the kind that made his squadron mates trust him with their lives. Halston's journey to the cockpit wasn't a story of instant heroism. Like most pilots, he had come from humble beginnings. His father was a mechanic, his mother a schoolteacher. Growing up, he was a restless spirit, always looking up to the sky. By the time he enlisted, he was more than ready to trade in his civilian life for the unpredictable world of fighter aviation. He made it through the grueling training program, quickly distinguishing himself not just for his flying skills, but his ability to remain composed under pressure. By 1944, the skies over Europe had turned into a deadly chessboard. The Luftwaffe's last-ditch efforts to stave off defeat had forced the Allied air forces to adapt, and adapt quickly. But despite the growing urgency of the war effort, the days spent in the air were wearing on Halston. The tension was palpable. Fighter pilots were constantly faced with the risk of encountering the enemy's best, the German aces whose reputation for deadly precision was enough to make even the bravest hesitate. But Halston wasn't one to let fear dictate his actions. It wasn't just the pressure of the enemy that weighed heavily on the pilots' minds. It was the constant fear of what came next. Every mission felt like it could be their last, and rumors had begun to swirl about new German tactics, more organized, more daring. There were whispers about radar-controlled German interceptors, new fighters capable of outmatching anything the Allies had in the air. As Halston readied himself for his next mission, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The enemy was evolving, and he knew the Allies had to keep pace, or fall behind. The night before the mission, as he and his squadron gathered in the briefing room, there was a sense of unease in the air. The typical banter and camaraderie that often filled the room had been replaced with a quiet apprehension. Even Halston, who had weathered countless missions without so much as a flinch, found himself distracted, lost in thought. What if they were walking into a trap? What if this mission was more than just another routine bomber escort? The orders were clear. Fly a protective cover for a group of B-17 bombers heading toward a target in Germany. It seemed like a simple enough task. The P-47 Thunderbolt was built for this, fast, heavily armed, and able to take damage without losing its edge. Halston had flown escort missions dozens of times before, and they were usually straightforward. But today, something didn't sit right. He glanced over the mission briefing once more. A few of the younger pilots exchanged nervous looks. Halston noticed it. He could always sense when something was off with his squadron. Everyone was on edge, but they were professionals. They knew their job. As they took off in formation the following morning, the clouds stretched thick above them. Visibility was low, but not enough to be a concern. Yet, the escort was supposed to be routine. They'd stick with the bombers until they reached enemy airspace, then watch for any sign of trouble. But in the back of his mind, Halston couldn't help but wonder. Was this the calm before the storm? The tension in the air was rising, and Halston knew this mission wasn't going to go as planned. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. And then it came. The first German fighters appeared out of the mist. At first, they seemed like just another attack. But Halston quickly realized that this was no ordinary assault. The enemy had something far more sinister planned. The morning fog was still thick as the squadron of P-47s cruised above the European countryside. From the cockpit, the world seemed to stretch into an endless sea of clouds, with only the occasional glimpse of the ground below to break up the monotony. The bombers they were assigned to protect flew in tight formation beneath them, their engines humming steadily in unison. There was a sense of calm, a false reassurance in the air. Everyone knew what to expect. This was supposed to be a routine escort mission. They had done it 100 times before, but this time the routine was about to be shattered. As they approached enemy territory, Halston's mind remained sharp, his eyes scanning the skies in every direction. A veteran of countless dogfights, he was always alert for the slightest hint of danger. His instincts were finely tuned. And today they were whispering one thing. Something wasn't right. The weather had made the skies unusually quiet, but Halston couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the Germans were already waiting. His gut was telling him that they had planned something different. "Stay alert, Hawk," his wingman called out over the radio, breaking his train of thought. "We've got this." Halston nodded, adjusting his grip on the throttle. His squadron was flying in a loose formation above the B-17s, as they always did, high enough to give them an edge in a quick engagement, but low enough to stay in touch with the bombers. The B-17s, with their heavy payloads, were vulnerable, easy targets for enemy fighters looking to disrupt Allied air superiority. But Halston trusted his squadron. They had seen it all, and they knew how to protect the bombers. But then, just as they neared the edge of enemy airspace, the first sign of trouble appeared. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the distance. Halston's eyes narrowed as he squinted through his visor. A lone shape, fast and nimble, emerged from the clouds. It was a German fighter, a FW-190, diving toward the formation. The unmistakable roar of its engine reached Halston's ears before he could even register the threat. It wasn't just one plane. There were more. A lot more. Within seconds, dozens of enemy aircraft appeared from the fog, surrounding the squadron like vultures. Halston's stomach dropped as the reality of the situation set in. This wasn't a simple skirmish. The Germans weren't just attacking, they were ambushing. As the enemy fighters swarmed in, Halston's thoughts raced. They had been walking into a trap the entire time, The Germans had been waiting for them, using the thick clouds to mask their approach. And now the P-47s were caught in the perfect crossfire. There was no clear way out. The bombers were vulnerable, and Halston knew that if he didn't act fast, this could turn into a bloodbath. "Break formation!" Halston barked into his headset. His voice was calm, but there was urgency in it. "Everyone scatter! Stay with the bombers, but keep moving!" The squadron immediately snapped into action, weaving and banking to avoid the incoming barrage of fire. Halston's heart pounded as he followed his own orders, diving to evade the incoming flak. The sky was suddenly filled with explosions, flashes of bright light as enemy shells found their mark. P-47s and FW-190s danced around each other in the sky, locked in a deadly ballet, as Halston's mind raced to stay one step ahead of the chaos. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the skies went silent for a split second. But that silence didn't last. From the corner of his eye, Halston saw the first wave of German fighters dive down in perfect coordination. The ambush was far worse than he could have imagined. The Luftwaffe had outflanked them from above, and now, with most of the squadron caught in the deadly crossfire, Halston knew that the real fight was just beginning. The bomber formation was in serious jeopardy. Halston quickly assessed the situation. They were spread out, disorganized, and under heavy attack. It was up to him to turn the tide, and that meant taking on the entire German assault head-on. But Halston wasn't afraid. If anything, the fire in his chest only burned hotter. His instincts screamed at him to act, to protect the squadron and the bombers. He had no choice but to break off and confront the German fighters directly. As he pushed the throttle forward and dove into the fray, one thought consumed him. If I don't do something now, we could lose it all. And it was at that very moment, as Halston went headfirst into the battle, that he realized just how much was on the line. His quick thinking would save his team, but it would also cost him everything. The world exploded in front of Halston as he tore through the skies, pushing the P-47 to its limits. The German fighters were everywhere, darting, diving, and weaving in a deadly choreography, each move calculated to take down as many Allied planes as possible. In that moment, the usual feeling of adrenaline before battle was replaced by something deeper: urgency. The bomber formation had been completely exposed, and Halston knew that if he didn't act fast, the mission, and everyone in it, was doomed. Without hesitation, he broke from the chaos of the dogfight, peeling away from his wingman to engage a pair of FW-190s who were closing in on the bomber's tail. His mind raced as he lined up the first shot. He needed to disrupt their attack, but not at the cost of his own life. With the Thunderbolt's powerful engine roaring beneath him, he dove into the fray, aiming for the rear fighter. The first German plane flashed in his sights, and Halston squeezed the trigger. The P-47's 50-caliber machine guns erupted, sending a spray of tracer rounds toward the enemy fighter. The German pilot jerked his plane to the right, narrowly avoiding the deadly hail of bullets. Halston swore under his breath and banked hard to follow, already calculating his next move. The fighter wasn't retreating, it was regrouping, trying to get the drop on him. As Halston leveled out, the second German fighter came into view. This one was faster, sleeker, a Me-262, the terrifying jet fighter that had begun to make its mark on the battlefield. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was a harbinger of the new era of war, a jet-powered terror. Halston knew he had to deal with this one quickly. The Me-262's speed advantage was massive, and if it reached the bombers before he could intervene, the damage would be catastrophic. Halston pushed the Thunderbolt harder, banking sharply as the jet tore past him in a blur of speed. His heart hammered in his chest. The Me-262 could outrun him, but it wasn't as maneuverable as the P-47. He had to rely on his instincts now. "Stay on him," he muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the controls. The distance between him and the jet was closing fast. In the corner of his eye, he saw his squadron trying to keep the Germans at bay, but they were outnumbered, and the fighters were getting bolder. Then, a sharp pain in his chest as an explosion rocked the plane. The world seemed to stop for a second. Halston's vision blurred as he fought to regain control, his stomach lurching as the Thunderbolt suddenly shuddered under the impact. His instruments went haywire, and he could hear the unmistakable sound of engine failure as the once steady hum of the P-47's engines sputtered. His plane was hit, badly. The hydraulic systems were offline. The left wing was damaged. He had no time to waste. His heart raced as the realization hit him. He was losing the fight. "Come on, you old girl," he muttered, his knuckles white against the controls. The P-47 groaned and shook beneath him, but it wasn't giving up. It was still flying, barely. Halston knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. He was exposed, and every second spent in the air was one more second that could cost him everything. The German fighters were relentless. He was flying alone now. The squadron had scattered to avoid the ambush, and he was surrounded. If he didn't make a decision fast, the next attack could be his last. Halston's eyes darted over the instruments. Fuel was low, and his controls were sluggish. The situation was grim. He needed to get out of the fight and get back to base, but that wasn't going to be possible. He couldn't risk leading the Germans back to the rest of the squadron, especially with the bombers still vulnerable. There was only one thing left to do. With a deep breath, Halston made the call. He would ditch the plane, but not alone. In a split-second decision, he broke hard to the left, drawing the German fighters away from the formation. His move was calculated, instinctual. His job now wasn't to fight. It was to sacrifice. By pulling the German planes off the squadron, he bought his comrades time to get back to safety. He turned the crippled P-47 into a sharp dive, using gravity to add speed to his escape. He'd lead them away as long as he could. His squadron had to survive, no matter the cost. The Germans were still on him, relentless. They followed his every move, but this wasn't about the fight anymore. It was about something bigger. Halston had made his choice, and now it was time to act on it. He was going to ditch the plane and sacrifice himself to save the mission, but he wasn't going down without a fight. But even as the plane spiraled towards its doom, Halston's fight was far from over. The enemy fighters were still hot on his tail, and the real battle, one against nature, was only beginning. The P-47's engines sputtered again, louder this time, as if protesting the abuse it had endured in the face of the relentless German fighters. Halston's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The aircraft was losing power fast. The rattling of the fuselage and the absence of the comforting hum of the engine told him all he needed to know. He was no longer in control of this plane. He quickly assessed the situation. The left wing was practically useless. The hydraulics were gone, making it nearly impossible to control his ailerons. The rudder and elevator still worked, but just barely. Fuel was leaking out of the wing, and the engine, if it wasn't already out of the fight, would soon quit completely. The damage was severe, but he still had one card left to play. He could ditch the plane. It was the only chance he had to survive, and maybe, just maybe, save his squadron. The German fighters were still trailing him, but Halston didn't have the luxury of a high-speed escape. They were too fast, too skilled. His only option was to buy time, keep them distracted long enough to get as far from the formation as possible. As he glanced over his shoulder, he could see the shadow of an FW-190 closing in, its nose aiming directly for him. A flash of light from the enemy's guns sparked across his wing, and Halston was thrown against his seat, the force of the impact leaving him momentarily dazed. "Focus, Hawk! Focus!" he muttered under his breath, snapping his attention back to the cockpit. He gritted his teeth and gripped the controls harder, pulling the Thunderbolt into a sharp turn. The plane groaned, as if it, too, was screaming out in pain, but it held its course. Halston had been in worse situations before. He had trained for moments like this, but nothing prepared him for the sheer desperation of this moment. He couldn't outrun the fighters, and he couldn't keep his plane in the air much longer. There was only one option left: ditch. His mind raced. How far could he make it? How much time did he have before the Germans zeroed in on him? The nearest Allied base was too far, and the Channel was the only chance. But landing in the open water wasn't guaranteed survival. The cold temperatures, the vast expanse of the sea, the uncertainty of rescue. It was a risk he had to take. If he ditched too soon, he might not survive the crash. If he waited too long, the enemy would finish him off. Every second counted. Halston pushed the throttle forward, coaxing what little speed the engine could give. The FW-190 was still on his tail, growing closer with every passing moment. He was running out of altitude. He had to make the choice now. His eyes scanned the horizon. The Channel lay ahead, a vast open expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of the decision was almost too much to bear. His squadron, his brothers in arms, had been counting on him. If he didn't make it back, they would never know just how much their survival had cost him. "Here goes nothing," he whispered, and with that Halston made his move. With all the precision he could muster, he yanked the stick to the left, banking hard toward the water. The P-47 groaned in protest, but it held. His ears rang with the roar of the engine sputtering and the distant sound of enemy fire. But in that moment, nothing mattered except the water ahead. The P-47's nose dipped, and Halston pulled the throttle back, aiming for the smoothest ditching possible. He was just about to reach the edge of the Channel when another blast of enemy fire rang out. This time it hit his tail, sending the plane into an uncontrollable spin. He fought with the controls, trying to regain some semblance of direction, but the force was too great. Halston felt the stomach-churning lurch as the P-47 flipped over and began to plummet toward the cold waters below. Time seemed to stretch out as he struggled to pull the nose up, the wind howling in his ears. In those final moments, as he braced for impact, Halston thought about his squadron, his brothers, who would make it back safely because of the sacrifice he was making. The impact came quickly, violent, sudden, and the last thing he remembered before everything went black was the deafening crash of the Thunderbolt hitting the freezing waters of the Channel. What happened next would be nothing short of a miracle. Halston had survived the crash, but the fight for his life was far from over. Stranded in the cold, with the threat of drowning or being found by the enemy, his battle had only just begun. The cold hit him like a hammer as Halston's P-47 plummeted into the icy grip of the English Channel. He had never been this close to death before, yet now, surrounded by the relentless water, it felt almost inevitable. The once thrumming roar of the engine was gone, replaced by the deafening rush of water flooding into the cockpit. His body slammed forward into the harness as the plane violently splashed down, the force of the impact numbing him instantly. For a moment, everything went black. His head throbbed as the cold water rushed in. He instinctively reached to unbuckle himself, his hands frozen and uncooperative. The cockpit was quickly filling up. There was no time to waste. The side of his head stung from the hit, but the need to survive pushed everything else to the back of his mind. "Stay calm, stay calm," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the roaring of water around him. With shaking hands, he freed himself from the seatbelt and, gritting his teeth against the shock of cold, forced himself out of the seat. His body felt heavy, sluggish as he fought to climb out of the sinking cockpit. The freezing salt water was like a vice, pulling him under the surface as he finally managed to break free. For a moment, he was fully submerged. The water was freezing, the kind of cold that steals your breath away and numbs you in seconds. His mind was a swirl of panic, his arms flailing as he pushed against the current, but his limbs felt like they belonged to someone else, frozen and stiff. He kicked hard with his legs, trying to get above the surface. Then his head broke through the surface, and the sharp, biting cold air filled his lungs. He gasped, struggling to stay above the waterline, but the channel was vast, endless in every direction. The horizon was nothing but a murky gray blur. The sky was as cold as the sea, dark clouds swirling ominously above him. His body ached, and the cold was draining the life from him, bit by bit. Hypothermia was setting in. He had been in the water only moments, but the exposure was already taking its toll. Halston's teeth chattered uncontrollably, his muscles seizing up. He needed to get to the life raft. The life raft, he knew, was supposed to be just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. In the distance, he saw the outline of the wrecked P-47 sinking deeper, disappearing into the channel's depths. The last remnants of the plane, once a deadly machine that had fought against the Luftwaffe, were now nothing more than a hollowed-out husk being pulled under by the sea. Halston tried to force himself to stay focused. He couldn't let it take him too. He spotted the life raft, the small rubber dinghy that could be his only hope. His body fought him every inch of the way, but he kicked and paddled, pushing himself toward it, every movement costing him precious energy. The sea was cold enough to strip the breath from his lungs, but he had no choice. As the raft came into view, his vision blurred. He could barely move his arms now, his body too stiff to function as he wanted it to. His thoughts were muddled by fatigue and the biting chill of the water. It was an instinct more than anything that drove him forward, some small part of him that refused to give in to the cold, refusing to be swallowed by the sea. With a final desperate push, he grabbed the side of the raft and hauled himself in, his limbs trembling violently with the shock of the cold. The raft bobbed beneath him as he clung to its sides, unable to do much more than collapse in a heap. The few moments of respite on the raft were fleeting. His body was still in shock, his teeth chattering violently as he curled into a tight ball to conserve what little heat he had left. For the first time since he had ditched the plane, Halston had a moment of clarity. It felt surreal. The feeling of being free from the wreckage, the relentless assault of enemy fighters, the weight of the mission, and his crew all slipping away. The only thing left now was survival. But even then, it felt like a distant hope, just out of reach. He grabbed the flare gun strapped to the raft with numbing fingers. The small metal tool felt foreign in his hand, as though it belonged to someone else. His thoughts were foggy, the weight of exhaustion threatening to pull him under again. He knew he couldn't afford to wait long. If he stayed out here too long, hypothermia would claim him, no matter how much willpower he had. Rescue was his only hope. Through shaking fingers, he managed to load the flare gun. His heart raced as he aimed it toward the gray sky. The pull of the trigger was heavier than he remembered, the flare shooting up in a burst of fiery red against the dull clouds. The flare arced upward, its light a beacon in the storm. It illuminated the water around him for a moment before it fizzled out, leaving Halston with nothing but silence. But then, there it was, a faint sound, the distant hum of an engine. His ears, still ringing from the crash and the water, barely registered the noise at first, but then it grew louder. A plane, a rescue plane. His heart surged in his chest, and with all the strength he could muster, Halston lifted his arm in a final, feeble attempt to signal. The last thing he remembered before his body gave way to exhaustion was the sound of the plane's engines growing nearer. The rescue was not only a physical lifeline, but a psychological one. Halston was pulled from the depths, but it was the aftermath of that moment that would leave its scars on his body, mind, and soul. And the story of what happened next would shape the rest of his life. The first thing Halston felt when he was pulled from the freezing waters was warmth. It was not a luxury he had known in hours, maybe longer. His body, still in shock from the cold, barely registered the change at first. But as he was hauled into the rescue aircraft, the rush of heat from the cabin enveloped him, and his numb limbs slowly began to regain feeling. His teeth stopped chattering. His muscles, tight from hours of freezing exposure, loosened bit by bit. The immediate threat of death was gone, but the toll was far from over. Halston's mind was a haze. His vision swam, and his body felt like it didn't belong to him anymore. His limbs ached with each shallow breath. He could hear voices, muffled at first, then growing clearer. The rescue crew had already begun working to revive him, wrapping him in blankets, slipping IV fluids into his veins, trying to force life back into a man who had nearly been swallowed by the cold. Halston's body was shaking, but it wasn't just from the frostbite anymore. It was a deep, lingering fatigue that had set into his very bones, a kind of exhaustion that wasn't just physical, but emotional. He had survived the ditching. He had made it out of the water, but he wasn't sure yet if he was ready to face what came next. The rescue team moved quickly, applying their expertise to stabilize him. Halston could barely keep his eyes open, his body aching for rest, but there was something gnawing at him, something he couldn't shake. The mission hadn't been about him. It had been about the squadron, about the bombers. He had sacrificed everything to save them, and now, as his body slowly regained strength, the reality of what he had done began to settle in. What had happened to the rest of his squadron? What happened to the bombers? Had his desperate actions worked? The question lingered in the back of his mind, but there was no immediate answer. All he knew was that he was alive, and that was a miracle in itself. When they finally landed back at base, Halston was escorted to a medical tent where doctors tended to the frostbite on his hands and feet, as well as the bruises and cuts from the crash. The pain was sharp, but he barely noticed it. His mind was elsewhere, still reliving the seconds of the fight, the split-second decisions he had made, the feeling of the plane diving toward the water. Then he was surrounded by his squadron members. They entered the tent in groups, some walking, others being carried in on stretchers. But when they saw him, there was a collective pause, some in disbelief, some in awe. There was no grand speech, no fanfare. Halston wasn't the type to seek glory, and his comrades knew it. But the looks on their faces told him everything he needed to know. "You saved us," one of the younger pilots said, his voice thick with emotion. Halston didn't have the words to respond. How could he? He had done what was necessary to give them a fighting chance. But the cost of that decision was more than just the physical toll. He had sacrificed a part of himself that day. That was something he'd carry with him forever. The debriefing was almost an afterthought. The mission had been chaotic, and the loss of Halston's aircraft had nearly led to disaster. But what wasn't immediately clear was how crucial his sacrifice had been. Halston's actions in diverting the German fighters away from the bomber formation had been the key to preventing a devastating attack. His decision to ditch his plane had allowed the rest of the squadron to return safely, especially the bombers, who had been the primary target. Later reports confirmed that thanks to Halston's diversion, the bombers had suffered minimal damage. The squadron had lost one plane, but the mission had been a success in the end. It was a bittersweet victory. Halston's courage and selflessness had saved lives, but the emotional weight of that victory was heavy. In the weeks that followed, Halston would rarely speak of what had happened. He wasn't one for boasting or recognition, but what he didn't realize at the time was that the legacy of his actions would endure far beyond that single mission. His story would circulate through the ranks, an example of bravery, sacrifice, and leadership in the face of overwhelming odds. But perhaps the most poignant thing was the quiet reflection among the men of his squadron. They all knew that on any given day, it could have been any one of them making that ultimate decision. In war, survival wasn't just about skill in the air. It was about the ability to make life-and-death choices in a heartbeat. Halston had done that, and in doing so, he had saved them all. Though Halston's bravery would go on to be remembered by his fellow pilots, there were still untold stories and unknown details about what truly happened in those final moments of the mission. The legacy of that day, and what it meant for the future of the squadron, would reveal more than anyone had anticipated. In the months after Halston's harrowing mission, word of his courage and self-sacrifice spread throughout the squadron. The story of his desperate ditching became one of the most talked-about events in the unit, but what the men didn't realize at the time was how much his actions had affected the broader picture. The immediate aftermath of Halston's decision didn't just save the squadron. It changed the way the Air Force approached combat, altering how they would think about tactics, survival, and camaraderie in future missions. Initially, the official debriefing had painted Halston's actions as a noble but unremarkable part of the larger battle. After all, there were other pilots who had made similar decisions. But the deeper analysis revealed something much more critical. Halston's daring maneuver had foiled a German strategy that the Allies hadn't anticipated. German intelligence had learned that the Allies were beginning to focus heavily on high-altitude bombings, relying on fighter escorts to protect their bombers. What they didn't know was that the Allies had adjusted their tactics to fly in larger formations, making it harder for the Luftwaffe to penetrate their defenses. The Germans, desperate to turn the tide, had started using a tactic that involved intercepting the bomber formations from above and diving in from the rear, a strategy designed to break up the defensive perimeter and leave the bombers vulnerable to follow-up attacks. This was exactly what had happened that day, but Halston's quick thinking, his decision to pull the German fighters off the bombers and risk his own life, disrupted that plan. He drew the enemy fire toward himself, preventing a direct hit to the bomber formation, and allowed the rest of the squadron to regroup and provide defense. What no one realized at the time was that this would become a major turning point in air tactics for the Allies. Historians later discovered that the German attack on this mission was part of a new strategy designed to take down the Allied bombing fleets in one decisive strike. Halston's heroic action had disrupted it, forcing the Luftwaffe to adjust their tactics in response. It was a subtle shift in the balance of power in the skies. The Allies were now aware of how aggressive the Luftwaffe was willing to be, and that knowledge would prove invaluable in later operations. Meanwhile, Halston, despite all the recognition from his comrades and the squadron, remained modest. He never once sought out praise or attention. He downplayed his role, focusing instead on the fact that the mission had been successful, that the bombers had made it back safely. In fact, when asked about the incident by senior officers, he simply said, "I did what any of you would have done." But beneath the modesty, something had changed in Halston. He began to carry a burden that no one else could understand. The image of his plane crashing into the sea, of being stranded alone in the channel, was one that haunted him in the quiet moments after the battle. Even in the comfort of home, the sound of water rushing into the cockpit and the cold seeping into his bones would return in nightmares. What Halston didn't know at the time was that his survival, his return to the squadron, had been a gift not just to his comrades, but to the broader cause. His actions were a reminder of the human spirit, the drive to protect, to defend, even when all hope seems lost. And even as the war dragged on, as victories and losses were tallied, his story became one that the squadron would tell to every new pilot who joined. It was no longer just about the mission, it was about the courage to make a decision that could change everything, even when the odds were impossible. It would take years for the full impact of that day to become clear, but as historians pieced together the mission reports, they found a remarkable pattern. Halston's sacrifice had not only saved lives in the moment, but had reshaped tactics, saving countless other airmen in the long run. The Germans had learned not to underestimate the Allies' resolve, and Halston, unknowingly, had become a symbol of that resolve. But the untold details didn't end there. In the years that followed, those closest to Halston would learn that his actions that day, his willingness to put the mission and his team above his own life, had led to unexpected consequences. Some squadron members, who had once seen him as a quiet, unassuming leader, began to wonder whether he had known more about the mission than he had let on. Did Halston understand that his sacrifice could be a strategic play, not just a desperate attempt to save the squadron? Was he a part of something bigger, a shift in Allied combat strategy that would unfold only after the war ended? Those questions lingered. But what remained certain, even as the years passed and the world moved on, was that Halston had done something extraordinary that day. He had put his team first, without hesitation, and in doing so, he had left a legacy far greater than any mission report could ever describe. As Halston's story was passed down through the generations of airmen, it became a powerful reminder of the choices soldiers make in the heat of battle, choices that can define history. And when the final chapter of this tale was written, it would ask the most important question of all: how many other unsung heroes like Halston made decisions that forever altered the course of the war? Halston's story is one that many of his squadron mates would carry with them long after the war ended. It wasn't just the extraordinary heroism that stood out, but the quiet, unsung sacrifice of one man who, in the blink of an eye, made a decision that would save not just a group of soldiers, but an entire mission. His actions were a testament to the kind of courage that defined the best of the greatest generation. The courage to put others first, to make a choice even when the odds were stacked against you, and to do it all without ever seeking recognition. In the years after the war, Halston would remain a humble man, refusing to let his actions be exaggerated or turned into myth. But his story would live on, not just in the hearts of his fellow pilots, but in the history of air combat itself. The tactics, the decisions, the lessons learned from that day, everything would resonate, shaping the future of aerial warfare and influencing countless other soldiers who found themselves in similar dire situations. Halston, unknowingly, had set the example for generations of fighters to come. His life and the events of that mission raise an important question. How many other untold stories like this one exist? How many men and women during times of war or crisis made a decision that changed the course of history? Their names may never be known, their actions never celebrated, but the ripples of their courage spread far beyond the battlefield. Some choices, no matter how small or unseen at the time, are the ones that truly define history. And as we reflect on Halston's legacy, we are reminded of a truth that transcends time. It's not the outcome that matters most, but the willingness to act, even when the odds seem impossible. It's about the heroism found in selflessness, in sacrifice, and in the belief that one person's choice can make all the difference. Perhaps the most striking part of Halston's story is not just the physical survival, but the survival of the spirit, the decision to push forward even when all seemed lost. That decision, that moment of clarity in the chaos of war, is what saved more than just his comrades. It saved an idea that in the end, humanity is defined not by the battles we fight, but by the choices we make, even in the darkest of times. So, as you think about Halston and his daring mission, remember that his story, like so many others, is a quiet call to action. It's a reminder that courage doesn't always come with a medal or a public ceremony. It often comes in the moments when no one is watching, when the choice is hard, and when the stakes are life and death. As for Halston, he would eventually return to civilian life, far from the roaring engines of combat, but always carrying the weight of that day with him. His story remains a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never ask for recognition, but simply do what is needed when the world needs it most. And that's the true legacy of the P-47 hero who chose to ditch his plane to save his team. His story wasn't just about surviving, it was about the heroism, the sacrifice, and the choices that defined a generation.